So welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to host this series of talks this morning as part of the Breaking Barriers Week, so Refugee Week at the University of Leicester. I'm your host for the talks this morning. So my name's Marie Nugent. I work as Public Engagement Manager for the University of Leicester. So it's a real pleasure to be able to learn more about some fantastic research that's going on in researching Refugeedom as part of today's event. So first things first, I'm just going to go through a bit of housekeeping. So as you're often asked in these things, please do keep yourself on mute. And we're going to encourage you to use the chat box to say hello and submit any questions that you might have for our speakers. Please, of course, be kind and respectful. If you do have any issues, you are welcome to send a private message to Pascal, who is behind the scenes, making sure this event runs smoothly for us this morning. And we're also recording this session for future use. So make sure, if you make sure you're on mute and things like that, you shouldn't appear in this recording or anything like that. So that should all be fine. And you'll also be sent a video to this recording once it's available. And if you have any general queries, please feel free to get in touch with sanctuary@le.ac.uk. So, as I said, I'm going to encourage some people to use the chat function. And yes, if you're not too shy, if you could say hello, it would be really nice to know who's in the room with us this morning. What brought you to this event this morning? Anything that you're hoping to learn more about? It's always nice to sort of know who's with us here. So you are welcome to do that throughout the session. And as I said, we'll be doing some Q&A at the end of the talks. So if you do have questions, make sure it's kind of quite obvious that you're submitting a question as part of the Q&A at the end, and that will just help me spot them a bit quicker. So hello and welcome everyone. So our speakers this morning, we have a range of speakers. Obviously, we're kind of small faces in the corner of a screen at the moment. So I'm going to give our speakers a chance to actually just say a quick hello before we launch into our talks. So first of all, we've got Agata. Agata, would you like to turn your mic on and just say hello?
Hi, good morning. I'm Agata and I'm talking to you from York today.
Great. And our second speaker will be Amy.
Hi everybody, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Amy. I work at the University of Leicester as a teaching fellow.
Lovely. And Anya will be our third speaker after a 5-minute break. So Anya, do you want to say hi?
Hello, I'm Anya and I'm speaking to you from Tunbridge Wells in Kent.
And last but not least, we have Kelly. So hi Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I work at the University of Leicester as well with Amy in the School of History, Politics and International Relations, but I'm actually coming to you from Sheffield in South Yorkshire this morning.
That's great. So it's a real pleasure to have a range of speakers from some different universities this morning. It's very exciting. So we are going to launch straight into our first talk, and that's going to be by Agata. So I'll hand over to Agata now.
Thank you, and I think it's working now. So thank you very much, Marie. Thank you, Pascal and Alex Paladas, who is also in the room, for inviting me to be here today and share my work with you. So the plan for my presentation is simple. So I'll introduce myself briefly and some of my work. I'll tell you a little bit about the current state of higher education participation by students with refugee backgrounds. I will follow this with a brief discussion of why universities and society at large should care about access to higher education for refugees, and how can we frame these discussions as a matter of internationalization, widening participation, or human rights and universities' third mission, that of service and social responsibility. Then I will highlight some of the key barriers identified in my own studies and those of my colleagues across Europe and beyond, before getting to the crucial questions of what can we do to do better as institutions, researchers, administrators, students, and other allies. I'm a freshly baked doctor, having completed my PhD in education at the University of York. on the topic of the neglected minority, higher education opportunities for refugee background students in England and Poland. And I continue to work at York at the moment. I've included the references to my thesis and an article and book chapter, as my presentation will be largely based on this. So you will have a reference here to look for more information if you're interested after this talk. Well, before I move on to discussing the issue of higher education specifically, we need a bit of context. As many of you probably know already, we are living in times of unprecedented recorded numbers of forced displacement globally. It has doubled in the last 20 years, and we are currently at the highest number in the almost 70-year history of the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. At the end of 2019, there were almost 80 million displaced people in the world, including 26 million refugees with a recognized status, and further 4.2 million asylum seekers, so refugees who have pending cases and are awaiting to be recognized by a host country. Now, my own research focuses on those who sought protection and better lives in Europe, although of course the majority, about 85% of world's refugees are hosted in developing countries, with 73% staying in neighboring states. Since 2015, however, with the so-called refugee and migrant crisis, Europe too has dealt with increasing numbers of refugees. 2.4 million refugees and people in refugee-like situations and 860,000 asylum seekers were hosted in the EU member states at the end of 2018. Although, like everything, the migration flows have of course been affected since the start of the pandemic, the past trends suggest that the numbers of people seeking harbor in Europe are likely to remain relatively high. Now, in this context, and in particular, if we consider the age of refugees coming to Europe, with almost half of the new applicants in 2019 being aged 18 to 34, which is the prime university-going age, and further 30% aged less than 18, and thus becoming university age at some point in the future, access to higher education seems like an important issue to consider. Now, higher education may not seem to be a priority subject, but we know that access to language training, work, and education, including higher education, are absolutely key to integration of any migrants, and that includes refugees. And I will talk a little bit about the benefits in a moment. According to the UNHCR, the UN Council for Refugees, right now only 3% of refugees worldwide have access to higher education opportunities. This issue has moved onto the global policy agenda in the last few years, but 3% is not good enough. And indeed, the goal of the UNHCR is to achieve 15% participation by 2030. But we are far off at the moment. To put this into perspective, according to UNESCO, almost 39% of young people in general population in the world, and in the EU it's 71%, access higher education. I've had an absolute privilege to research the barriers and issues faced by students with refugee backgrounds who aspire to access universities in Europe, and I looked at Poland and England specifically. I've spoken to refugees in higher education and those who have not yet been able to enroll, as well as staff in universities and third sector who are involved in one way or another to make this a possibility. So why is it a good thing to offer access to higher education opportunities for students with refugee backgrounds? Now, this is not without caveats, of course. It must be acknowledged that there are multiple arguments against making university education university available. For example, basic skill shortages can be linked to channeling of all supports towards higher education access. However, generally speaking, there are numerous benefits of higher education participation. Probably the most obvious and most widely researched are the individual market benefits to individuals. Those with university degrees in England and Poland at least are significantly more likely to be employed, to work full-time and earn more. But there are other benefits. So there is a positive correlation between having experience of higher education and the propensity to vote. Students and graduates are more likely to volunteer, participate in public debates like this one, and to trust and tolerate others in the society. Graduates are less likely to commit violent crimes, they live longer, enjoy lower child mortality rates, and are less likely to engage in unhealthy behaviors like smoking or drinking excessively. Graduates have better mental health, greater life satisfaction, and better general health. There are tax benefits and those related to national economic growth and prosperity for the societies with highly educated populations as well. There are also plenty of benefits of higher education in the context of development, which is relevant, of course, because some refugees will return to their countries or regions of origin. For the sake of time, I will just briefly mention some of the benefits for refugees while they live in the host states. And we must remember that many, if not majority, will remain in the host states long-term or permanently. So let's start with the market benefits. In the UK and other European states, rates of unemployment among refugees are much higher than the national average. In the UK, it was 49% against 27% in the general population in 2019. Asylum seekers without recognized status are, of course, completely excluded from the market. In Poland for the first 6 months and in England for 12 months at least. And only those with specific skills can request a work permit to work here after this time, to access jobs with shortage of workers, jobs which often require a university degree. So obtaining a degree offers a way of poverty, an opportunity to do something for asylum seekers awaiting for a decision on their application who cannot work. Research evidence in the past also that refugees, that education and higher education leads to emotional healing and lowering of levels of anxiety amongst refugees and provides them with stability and normality by developing a sense of belonging to an institution run by the host community. Research also shows that higher education leads to personal growth, social development, increased confidence and higher self-esteem, sense of hope and pride again amongst refugee background students. We also know that higher education benefits families and communities of refugees, but there are also benefits for the whole society. We know about the reduced fiscal costs, but we also know higher education can facilitate integration and it improves the university experience of all students. Like other disadvantaged groups, students with refugee backgrounds are often motivated to use their education to give something back and choose courses in healthcare, care and education. There are many more benefits and I could spend an hour just talking about those, so let's leave it here. But I hope that this brief summary just already shows why we should be doing something about this. And just finally, before we move on, it's worth pointing out that while it's difficult to quantify the demand for higher education among refugees in Europe, my own research and that of many others across Europe and beyond suggests that amongst refugees who completed secondary level education, there is an almost universal desire to continue education at the university level. And my own findings suggest that this extends to refugees with various previous educational experiences. So I've spoken to those who already hold degrees from their home states or third countries, but also those who have little formal education, who self-taught and hope to access higher education now that they have reached the relative safety in Europe. So we've established the access to higher education for refugee background students is important, I hope, and beneficial to everyone. Sorry, my slides decided to jump by themselves. And sorry, I'm going to try to go back to the right place. Here we go. I hope I didn't click too many times now. So although there are many barriers, as you would have seen from my slides, and I will discuss those in a minute, it's important to stress that universities and third sector have made enormous amount of progress in the support for refugees in the last few years. Some universities might approach this as part of their internationalization agenda, as suggested by my colleague Jana Berg in Germany. And Jana argues that we should be framing refugees as potentially highly performing international students and a positive enrichment of diverse and international universities. Alternatively, as suggested by evidence collected by Rebecca Murray, for example, in the UK, this may be included or seen as fulfillment of universities' duties as part of the existing widening participation agenda, with the bulk of outreach and promotion done by the widening participation teams, and some of the funding coming from the pot of money set aside for improving university access and participation for disadvantaged and marginalized groups. Alternatively, as I argue in my work, universities and institutions can approach supporting refugee communities, including supporting access to higher education, as a matter of their third mission. So next to research and teaching, that of service and social responsibility. In my work on access to higher education, I also focus on human rights-based approaches to higher education, and those who work directly supporting refugee background students in universities and third sector, as I found through interviews in my research, also view higher education as a matter of human rights that those with refugee backgrounds should be able to access if they wish to. Several of my interviewees have described participating in higher education as a key vehicle for challenging social injustice, increasing life chances for those who, by definition, as a group, have experienced some of the world's biggest injustices, and who continue to suffer through traumatic asylum process. Access to higher education is, in fact, of course, identified as a human right, as prescribed in international legal instruments. And it's a right belonging to everyone with a capacity to learn. And this capacity should be assessed in reference to all relevant expertise and experience and by all appropriate means. And nobody, including refugees, should be deprived of this right. And yet, let's look at some of the issues faced by refugee background students. In my work, I use the existing classification of barriers developed by Patricia Cross and updated by Potter and Alderman in the 1980s and 1990s. So the 4 groups of barriers include institutional, situational, academic, and dispositional barriers. I don't have time to talk about all of them in detail. This was a 20,000 words chapter in my thesis, but just a very small selection from the institutional and situational issues are highlighted on this and the next slide. So I focus here on the English context in particular. So institutional barriers can be a result of national policies imposed on universities or a consequence of structures and processes put in by universities themselves, overlooking the legal, economic, and social realities of refugee background students, and ignorant of the exclusionary constraints that these inflexible systems and processes result in. Examples include informational factors, so lack of quality information about rights of refugees and asylum seekers to access higher education, information about access to funding and application process. This is linked to financial factors, as asylum seekers actually don't have access to student funding in England, and scholarships are limited and criteria for these are sometimes still unclear. Procedural factors include issues related to level and type of credentials accepted by universities, and the fact that refugees are often unable to present their school certificates and undertake IELTS or similar acceptable language examination, partially due to the costs involved. This extends to the mode of application to universities too. So most undergraduate applications in England are via UCAS, but this application is not free. It costs about £26 at the moment, a relatively affordable amount for most. However, asylum seekers in particular are subject to already mentioned work restrictions, with most relying on government support, which equates to around £5.66 a day. And as one of my interviewees said, it's illustrated on the slide, you basically have to not eat for a certain amount of days to pay for that UCAS fee. This is just one way in which the institutional barriers relate to the situational barriers. Sorry, jumping through the slides again. Here we go. So the situational barriers can be defined as those relating to individuals' broad circumstantial conditions. So universities cannot effectively support access for refugee background students without understanding of their socioeconomic conditions and life within uncertain legal realities, and how such barriers interplay with those institutional ones. I'm not doing this. I'm not touching my computer, so I'm not sure who else is controlling the screen. But if we could go back to the previous slide, I'll try to do that. Okay, thank you. Apologies for that. So the situational barriers can include newcomer factors, so the lack of access to social networks of locals who understand the higher education system, which is an issue, and a lack of relevant cultural capital, that is familiarity with the dominant culture in the host state. Environmental factors can include the financial issues, so some already mentioned, but this extends to the lack of choice in where to live. So being offered a place at university is not a reason recognized as sufficient by the Home Office to approve move to a state-funded accommodation in a different part of the country where the university is from that in which Home Office decided to place someone seeking asylum. Educational factors include gaps in educational experiences and difficulties and delays in accessing appropriate level of language training in particular. One of the interviews said, and you probably can't read it, so I'll read it out. I went to college and they told me just to wait for 6 months. And that was the first time. And the second time when I went to them, they said to wait 20 days. And after that, you come for assessment and we will let you know what level you are. And after that, we will tell you when your studies will start. And they said that probably it will start in September. And this is a long time to spend, like 1 year without any studies in the country. So we're speaking about people who already experienced delays in their opportunities to access higher education opportunities, and this is delayed by further barriers within our own system. And on my next slide, I have a diagram of the different factors and how I see them as interconnecting. Here we go. And that's between the situational and institutional barriers, but there are also further overlaps with the academic and dispositional barriers that I've mentioned as well. And to reflect this complexity and magnitude of disadvantage faced by refugee background students, I use a term of super disadvantage in my work. And that's not to create a hierarchy of any sort, but to highlight to universities and other stakeholders that the gravity and the compound nature of the problems faced by refugee background students. And this is so that appropriate research frameworks and, more importantly, appropriate policies and practices can be developed to help tackle those interlinked issues. Well, so what can we do to do better? In the absence of relevant policy measures, what can universities do? What can researchers, students, and other allies do? Again, just a few suggestions here. A full chapter in my thesis. I have a lot of ideas of what we can do to do better, but just some suggestions here. So the universities must firstly ensure specialist information, advice, and guidance is available, starting with easy to find, clear, reliable information online. And this requires working with third sector organizations, local councils, schools, and colleges. Universities can use a targeted approach to widening participation, including by organizing information events and campus visits for refugee background students. Universities can open up facilities to local refugee communities, the library and gym, for example, to welcome potential future students with refugee backgrounds to university campuses. Providing access to free language provisions, so specialist English for academic purposes courses are already run by most institutions for our international students. So giving access to refugee background students to access those. Specialist access programs or funded places on foundation and access degrees around the country would be fantastic. Adding refugee background as a marker of disadvantage for contextual admissions to ensure that access is not barred for those without documentation or traditional qualifications. Direct applications instead of UCAS applications. We already offer those for master's programs. Could this be an option for students with refugee backgrounds? Where financial support is provided, this needs to include the cost of accommodation or travel and other hidden costs of higher education participation. Students' Union should work with universities to extend the social opportunities available to refugee background students. This could be achieved, for example, through waivers of science and social clubs fees, societies and events fees. Students' Union can also work with students and universities to develop and maintain a positive ethos towards forced migrants throughout the institutions, with events like this one today, for example. Developing awareness of the plight of refugees and encouraging positive and supportive attitudes from both staff and students and local communities will encourage a more inclusive environment for refugee background students. Researchers, schools, colleges, local councils, third sector organizations and students have a part to play too. And I'll be very happy to answer your questions at the end of this session today. But I would like to ask you to consider as part of this event what you can do in your position, whatever it might be, to support refugee background students in accessing higher education. And you can email me your ideas or message me on Twitter. I would love to continue this discussion with anyone who would like to know more, but I'm almost out of time, so I will leave it here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Agata. That was a really great talk. I can see that there are a couple of questions and comments in the chats. As we said, just so that we can make sure we run on time, we're going to save those questions to the end. So thank you so much for that, Agata. It was really fascinating. I love that you called yourself a freshly baked doctor, and you've done some fantastic research there. That's really practical. And thank you for asking people to think, you know, what can we all do? What can I do to support refugees in accessing higher education? So thank you very much. We're now going to move on to our next speaker. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Amy Clarke. And I'm just going to hand over the control here to Amy, and off you go, Amy.
Thanks so much, Marie, and thank you very much, Agata. That was really, really interesting, and actually a little bit of overlap with the work that I've done. So this talk is going to be again focused on my PhD research, which, just like Agata, I officially finished last year. So I'm also a freshly baked doctor also. Let me see if I can. There we go. Okay, so in the presentation, as I said, I've had to pick kind of a very specific part of the project to talk to you guys about today, because of course PhD projects are just large in nature, aren't they? So you'll hear me talk a lot about targeted hostility and those experiences of targeted hostility experienced by new arrivals and refugees and asylum seekers in particular. So I'm going to spend a very quick few minutes at the beginning of this just telling you what targeted hostility means when I talk about it in a criminological context. I work in the School of Criminology and closely connected to the Centre of Hate Studies. So this is kind of the model of hate crime that we take when we engage with victims. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the experiences of direct and indirect victimisation as experienced by the new arrivals that I engaged with, and also their reasons for non-reporting of these incidents. The vast majority of people that I engaged with did not report any of their experiences to the police or any other authority. So it was important to kind of unpick all of the reasons that they gave as to why that was, because they varied depending on who they were and the situational factors. And throughout the talk, I will touch upon the impacts that these experiences were having on those individuals, but not just at an individual level, also in regards to the wider communities that they lived in. And although it's out of the scope of this discussion today, the project I did spend a good amount of time looking at the structural barriers that these types of experiences then created, and how that impacted opportunities for social mobility and meaningful integration as well. So if anybody does have any questions about that, I'm more than happy to answer that at a later date, because I just can't cover it in the talk today in detail. Okay, so what is targeted hostility? It's somewhat of an umbrella term to describe a wide range of victimizing behaviours. So what does it include and why did I use it? Many of you may already be aware, if you know anything about the field of hate crime, the official definitions by the College of Policing say that hate crime is any crime or incident where the perpetrator's hostility or prejudice against an identifiable group of people is a factor in determining who is victimised. And in the UK, we currently have 5 official monitored strands of hate crime, so race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and transgender identity. And the College of Policing are very clear in their guidance that immigrants, refugees and asylum seekers are covered under that race or ethnicity strand. But of course, they could be targeted for a number of reasons that may or may not be officially listed as a protected characteristic. And again, I don't have time to talk about all of the pros and cons of these official definitions, but on the whole, they're considered somewhat narrow. And I think it's because they have to be operationalized by criminal justice agencies. They have to be workable. But the downside of that is that they are somewhat exclusive, because they do tend to focus on these 5 strands. And although police forces across the country are able to record any form of hate crime that they want to, those non-monitored strands won't necessarily get prosecuted at a later date as a hate crime, because they don't fit into those 5 strands. And so for the purposes of my project, I used a slightly different definition, and this is part of the Centre for Hate Studies and the model of hate crime that we engage with most. And it's in an attempt to be more comprehensive and inclusive. So a hate crime refers to acts of violence, hostility and intimidation directed towards people because of their identity or perceived difference. And it's this perceived difference that's really important for this type of work, because when researching the experiences of refugees and asylum seekers, there may be many reasons that someone is targeted. So a perpetrator is not necessarily going to know a victim's legal status or their specific nationality. They're just going to perceive a difference, and that is what they're targeting. And that difference is usually something that's visible or audible. So using the term targeted hostility that is motivated by a perceived difference highlights a wider range of victimizing behaviors that goes from kind of being ignored or being bullied right through to those more serious violent and sexual assaults. Also, by moving away from official and exclusive definitions of hate crime, as well as race and ethnicity, it just allowed for a much broader range of experiences to be documented. So people who felt they were targeted because of their foreign identity or their perceived social and legal status as well, and many, many other factors. So I'm going to talk to you about the different levels of direct victimization that various people encountered to begin with. So the first being non-verbal hostility, and that was things such as being stared at, being ignored, being deliberately avoided, and generally being made to feel unwelcome and unwanted. And I have some examples of participants' experiences here. So we only wanted to ask directions. We went over to them, a white family. They saw us, got their children, kind of pushed them away and said, no, no, no. We didn't even get a chance to speak. Similarly, this is from Aziz. He said, we once travelled to Market Harbour to buy a car and everyone was white. We were the only ones not white, and lots of people were looking at us strangely, watching everywhere we were going. It made me feel uncomfortable and nervous. Participants, as well as very similar experiences to this across the board, participants also talked about often being tutted at, or people would just look at them and shake their heads and walk away. And it was really important for me to document all of these types of experiences because they were by far the most commonly occurring type of experience, and they were most likely to be the type of hostility that people experienced on an everyday or very frequent basis. Now, of those participants who experienced non-verbal hostility, most didn't consider themselves to be victims of hate crime, and they often described these incidents as minor or normal. But in this field of study, we would usually most likely describe these types of incidents as microaggressions. And these are kind of defined as insults and invalidations that are often subtle and non-criminal manifestations of discriminatory and racist behaviours. And there's been a lot more research in the last kind of decade or so on various different types of microaggressions, and particularly the cumulative harm that they can cause because they are happening on such a frequent, in some cases everyday basis. So I will touch back on the impacts of some of these microaggressions in just a second. So the next form of direct victimization, probably unsurprising to many of you, would be verbal abuse. So although not as frequently occurring as the non-verbal hostility, verbal abuse had been experienced at least once by the majority of participants. And overt verbal abuse was most often reported by participants who were visibly identifiable as Muslim, especially Muslim women who wore any kind of religious dress. And the intersection between gender and faith in this context of a Muslim woman is supported by other research in the field as well. So Hannah Mason-Bish and Irene Zempi also write about this, and they say that routine representations of Muslim women as culturally dangerous and threatening, but also simultaneously as oppressed characters, means that they experience elevated levels of hate crime motivated by both Islamophobia and misogyny. And so it's really important when working in this field to acknowledge all the different intersections of a person's identity. And although it's possible that somebody is targeted purely for one reason and one reason only, actually a significant number of people are targeted because of multiple aspects of their identity. And because hate crime is very victim-centered, it matters less about why the perpetrator is motivated, and more about what the victim perceives it to be, because that's what counts when it comes to reporting. So this approach really strengthened the work that I took, because in addition to their gender and faith, when participants were also asylum seekers and refugees, this sometimes created a sense of powerlessness, or that they were a particularly easy target in the eyes of the perpetrator. And the non-verbal hostility and verbal abuse that I've talked about so far were very commonplace. And despite the notion that these are fairly low-level incidents, it became evident that they were still having a considerable impact on victims. And so this is a quote from one of my field diary entries. So I said, sometimes I feel like I hear the same stories over and over, but actually each time I hear something slightly different. The women still say they are not bothered about what they call minor incidents, such as being stared at, ignored, generally treated differently, and occasionally called names. Their response is generally to just ignore it. But now they also talk about sleepless nights, depression, and feeling scared all the time. So it was only through kind of continued engagement that these impacts really started to show themselves in the discussions that I was having. And so again, it kind of speaks back to other microaggression research, which is demonstrating the cumulative harm of these incidents. Okay, so we also had direct victimization in the form of threatening behaviour, ongoing harassment, and property damage. And unlike verbal abuse, which was most likely to be perpetrated by strangers, other forms of targeted hostility were most likely to be perpetrated by neighbours or others known to the victim. And this is also supported by previous research as well. So that in the Leicester Hate Crime Project, it was also found that refugees and those with asylum seeker status were more likely to be targeted by neighbours than anyone else known to them. And so examples like this were repeated to me in slightly different forms on multiple occasions. So Me and my wife were given a house in Braunston, predominantly white area in the west of Leicester, if anybody's unsure. I saw men covered in tattoos who came to my house, stood outside, and every time they saw us, they would say, "Why are you here? Go back to where you came from." They would break into the house. But if you want to move, it can take a long time. I saw people get burgled several times. Every time they replace the locks or fix the window and get all new stuff, they just break in again and take all of your stuff. And it was experiences like these that in many cases the impacts resulted in those people living increasingly isolated and restrictive lives. So they would avoid certain areas, avoid contact with others around them. They felt a reduction in self-confidence. And those who previously described themselves as outgoing reported that they felt significantly impacted by the negative experiences in their neighbourhoods. And this was especially compounding for parents who also then had significant fears and concerns about the safety of their children. I would also say, I didn't quite finish that point. Over time, what became important for the project I was doing was kind of thinking about how these impacts, when they were long lasting and when these experiences were happening frequently, the barriers that that created for any sort of meaningful integration at a later stage. So that was something else that the project looked at specifically. But other than those individual levels and even family levels of impacts, it was also important to think about the wider communities that these people were from and the impacts of indirect victimization. So while some participants had never experienced hate crime or targeted hostility themselves, almost every participant knew at least one other person in Leicester who had. And this is consistent with other research in the field. So the Sussex Hate Crime Project found that 80% of participants knew someone who had been victimised in the previous 3 years. So it is a considerable number of people. If they hadn't experienced it themselves, they knew at least one other person who had. And they would often talk about their own experiences interchangeably with the experiences of others known to them, often because they were so similar. And this was sort of evidence that we already know hate crimes act as message crimes. So the victims are targeted purely because of a perceived aspect of their identity. And so for the perpetrator, they are essentially interchangeable with anyone with this perceived identity. The victimization therefore sends a message to anyone who is like the victim that they are unwanted and that they are also at risk of experiencing this same sort of victimization. And when you look at the impacts of this indirect victimization, you see the parallels. They are essentially the same as if somebody has been targeted themselves. So they frequently talked about fear, vulnerability, anxiety, and sadness when hearing or discussing the victimization of others in their communities. So again, this is from a field diary entry of mine. So Fatima and Samia have both recently been granted leave to remain and were talking about where they thought they would be moved to by the council. Fatima said she has heard that more refugee families are being offered houses in Braunston, and this was causing them significant concern. Samia said a friend of hers told her it was a very racist area and that local residents will vandalise the houses of refugees there. They expressed several times throughout the conversation that they would not feel safe there. So particularly for close-knit families, close-knit communities, they are of course very aware of these community level narratives and the stories and the experiences of others, and that particularly has an impact then on their decision making. And for refugees and asylum seekers, this is particularly pertinent because, especially if they have only recently moved to an area, then they tend to rely heavily on the experiences of those known to them to inform them about the wider society. And as I said, their decision making is therefore that affects their everyday lives is also greatly influenced by the experiences of others. So the idea of who to engage with or who to avoid, as well as a very clear understanding of safe and unsafe spaces in their area, all of this is shared community knowledge. And this leads to all kinds of ways in which participants would alter their appearance or identifiers that they thought would make them a target. And they would try to conform to sort of stereotypical perceptions of the good immigrant or the grateful immigrant or refugee in order to try and avoid that sort of detection. So the final thing that I'm going to touch upon are these narratives then for non-reporting of these incidents. I don't have the kind of exact statistics because it was an entirely qualitative study, but about 90% of people who had experienced these sorts of incidents didn't report to the police. A handful reported to local authorities like housing or the local council because it impacted the situation in which they were living, and that was their priority. But it's unclear as to whether those incidents were then recorded as hate crime by the people they were reporting to. So I've kind of broken this down into 3 overarching narratives that kind of emerged from the findings. So particularly when discussing everyday experiences of targeted hostility, new arrivals would downplay or trivialize their experiences, and they would describe them as harmless, unimportant, or trivial. And in particular for refugee participants, they tended to perceive their experiences in the UK as tolerable, particularly when they compared them to previous experiences in other countries. So Darian here is saying, I get name shouted at me. My neighbour told me I was vermin once in front of my children. But we see this as a minor thing, not like we had in Germany. It was so racist there. We were so unhappy. We lived in a refugee camp. It was awful. I feel much safer here, so it's better. So there was this constant kind of comparative thing going on where, particularly if they had experienced not just in other European countries, but of course across the world, the incredibly oppressive and quite traumatizing experiences that they'd had, that compared to that, kind of living in the UK and experiencing this targeted hostility at any level, again, they felt was tolerable. And so it wasn't something that they thought they would report to the police. But also perhaps in some cases because of what they had experienced before, but also just on a personal level, there was a huge amount of resilience shown by the people that I worked with. And they talked about learning to cope or learning to ignore these sorts of experiences. And just like any other type of victim of any other type of crime, many participants talked about using their friends, family, religious leaders, and the wider community as a supportive structure to heal and move on from the event. And this does have some potential benefits because not reporting to the police in some cases did mean that the situation was less disruptive to their daily lives, because of course some people were experiencing this on a very, very frequent basis. And so they said, I'm not going to report this to the police. I'd spend half my life in a police station if I did. And so without that disruption to their daily lives, they were able to move on from that experience much quicker, they felt. So another narrative that came through was the reasons for not reporting related to concern with keeping a low profile. And partly it was to avoid being labelled a troublemaker in case this impacted their leave to remain. So there was a definite fear of the authorities getting involved. And of course, it was raised several times that law enforcement agencies in some countries where refugees came from were an arm of the oppressive state that they were fleeing from. And so there was a definite fear of the police in some cases, and also a misunderstanding about the role of the police in the UK as well, perhaps unsurprisingly. But there was also this notion of not wanting to draw attention to themselves or their community for fear of victimisation. So with all this Brexit stuff, I just think anything that makes us look bad, they will make a big thing out of it. If we all start saying, oh, they were racist to me, and getting the police involved, I think that just makes us a target. So it was this idea of wanting to kind of fly under the radar, not to be detected, and keep themselves safe as a result. And although this only came up a couple of times, I still felt it important to reflect on. So in some cases, there were anti-reporting attitudes from within the community itself. So this was kind of beyond that, just wanting to keep a low profile, because in some cases, people actually expressed disapproval towards others who would consider reporting to the police. And again, there were fears about community reputation, kind of stereotypical conventional ideas about wanting to fit in, not drawing attention to yourself, again being that grateful immigrant, and just thinking you should feel lucky to be here, keep your head down and don't speak up if things go wrong. And again, these were coming from within some of these communities, so the impact that they may well have been having on others was potentially significant, because as I've already said, new arrivals are relying on the people around them to inform them of these kinds of things. But there was also a definite rejection of the victim label here. So especially for refugee participants who talked about their very traumatizing past experiences, rejecting the victim identity enabled them to counteract the feelings of powerlessness and vulnerability that they had experienced previously. So some participants did talk about taking back control. You know, I've had these awful, oppressive, victimizing experiences elsewhere. I'm not going to let it happen here again. So there was a sense of taking back control in that narrative as well. Okay, so just to quickly summarize the points that I've made here then. Everyday experiences of targeted hostility and hate crimes are widespread amongst refugee and asylum seeking communities. And of course, not just in Leicester. Leicester was the city in which this study was based, but it is a super diverse city, as are many more cities in the UK becoming super diverse. And so we expect to see these sort of patterns of behaviour arise elsewhere. Similar research has been done in Bradford and in Birmingham, showing very similar results. These experiences, often non-verbal microaggressions, verbal abuse and harassment, initially enforce and reinforce feelings of unwelcomeness and uncomfortability. But longer term, they also erode personal well-being and create feelings of sadness, fear, anxiety, embarrassment and humiliation. Hate crimes act as message crimes, so we mustn't forget the indirect victims and the impacts this can have on wider communities. There are many barriers for victims that mean they do not report to the police and other authorities, but normalising and minimising these experiences are very common. And this all speaks to some of the biggest barriers that cause new arrivals to live in such a restrictive way that really limits their opportunity for social mobility and more meaningful integration at a later stage. Okay, that's everything from me. Thank you so much. Feel free to ask questions. I'm more than happy to answer any. I think my email is also being shared, so I'm happy to take questions that way as well. But thank you all very much for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Amy. That was a really interesting talk. There's plenty of questions, I'm sure, but as we said, we're going to save those for the end. I hope you can now see the title slide of our next speaker's talk, Anya. So Anya, are you ready to start going through your talk again?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marie.
Okay,
Hi,
so you
everyone.
should be able to make a start now and control the slides, okay?
Yes, I've got it, I think. So it's nice to meet everyone. My name is Anya. I am a trainee clinical psychologist at Solomon's Institute for Applied Psychology at Canterbury Christ Church University. I'm talking to you from Tunbridge Wells in Kent, and I want to start by saying a huge thank you to Agata and Amy. Very interesting, very important, very emotive and valuable information. Thank you. I highly appreciate that. I'm afraid my talk will be a little bit less informative because I'm still in the process of making my study. My doctoral study is about experiences of refugees who come to UK as unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Oh, technical difficulties, sorry. Here we go. The aim of my study is to help other people in UK to understand experiences of these refugee people who come as unaccompanied children. And I come to this thinking from three places. One is as a human being, myself. Another is as a trainee psychologist. And the third one is as a researcher. And I will talk to you about it in a little detail. As a human being, I have left a scary and a dark place that once was my home in Ukraine. I was 14 when I left. I left behind frightening experiences, but I also left behind everyone I loved and everything I knew and everything that made sense to me. I came to UK alone to study, and when I arrived here, everything felt so different. The weather was wrong, the food was wrong, the road was on the wrong side, the cars were driving on the wrong side of the road, and the road signs were different. Well, there were road signs in the first place, unlike many places in Ukraine. The English language here in UK sounded nothing like the English language I learned at school in Ukraine. And I didn't know how to make friends with people who live in UK. And 20 years later, now I still make mistakes. UK has now been my home for 20 years, and yet every year I get a question from someone. So, are you going home for Christmas? And I say, I am home. And they say, no, but where is home? You know, home, you're clearly not at home. And I don't know if I ever will be perceived as someone who is at home. I come from a very, very, very privileged position. My family was able to afford my education here in UK, and I went on to receive higher education. And I'm doing a doctorate training now. And I cannot imagine what it is like to arrive to UK unaccompanied, young, without that privilege, and seeking safety and seeking international protection. And no wonder that we have the statistics that Agata, you talked about, 3% of refugees go on to receive a higher education. So yeah, I would like to understand what it's like to have those experiences. And this wanting to understand others, wanting to understand myself, have led me to psychology and to training in psychology. And as a trainee psychology, I have had so many stories of so many different people, and I have gotten the chance to tell my own story like I am doing today. And I found out that when we tell stories to each other and when we truly hear and truly listen to the stories of others, we can cross those borders, those invisible borders that exist between a multitude of cultures who live together in a home in UK. As a researcher, I have found out that about half of refugees all around the world are children, and about 111,000 of those children are displaced alone without their families. And just under 3,000 of these children who are displaced alone come to seek legal protection in UK. That was the statistics for 2018. And there are many stories in UK, many research stories, many social media stories, many television stories about refugees in general and about these particular children who come unaccompanied. And many of those stories are not true. And this is why this study really wants to help these refugees who came as children to tell the true stories. And I have found from research that one of the best ways to help people to tell and to share those difficult stories is to use photography together with words, with words that give interpretation to that photography. And this is why this study, my study, does employ both methods. I'm going to ask participants to take 3 pictures, 3 photographs that could help others to understand what was it like to travel to UK as a child without your family. What was it like to arrive to UK, and what helped you get through and survive and become who you are now. And after that, we would meet on Zoom and we would talk one-to-one for about an hour. We would look at all these photographs, and one by one, we will tell the story together about what it was like, what were all those experiences like. And looking at these photos, what do my participants want others to understand, to feel, to sense, to hear, to smell, to see, to touch in these photographs, to help us get the meaning. I want to ask my participants what these photos mean to them, and I want to know what these participants want the photographs to mean to other people, in order for other people in UK to understand them. And finally, I would love to hear what it's like to look back now as an adult, to look back on those experiences of being a refugee child. I'm hoping to talk to people who are young adults between ages 18 and 28, who came to UK as unaccompanied children, who are not currently experiencing significant emotional distress. By that I mean people who experience nightmares and flashbacks currently. It might not be the right time to take part in something like this. And finally, I have some funding for use of interpreters, so I can offer either we can speak in English or we can employ an interpreter. The study has been approved by my university. The ethical approval is granted. I will collate all the information from the photographs and from our conversations in a way that makes all participants anonymous. And I will put them all together into a report. This report will be published on my university website, and I will also send it to academic publications. And hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about this research like I'm talking about the beginning of this research today. Hopefully I'll get another chance when I come to the other end of it. And I will also send a short summary of the report to all of my participants and the charities and organizations and universities who support them. And of course, taking part in this study cannot help with immigration status and won't have any effect on any support, education, or any other rights that our participants have in the UK. Oops. I'm hoping that with this study, I can help my participants to convey the wide range of complexity of their journeys, their stories, and their lives. And this involves the difficult bit of getting to UK. This involves the difficult bit of living in the UK. But it also involves this other side that I think, Amy, you were talking about, the resilience, the growth, the strength of overcoming so much and continuing to face barriers to education, to people not breaking into your houses, to hate crimes and all of those things. For many of our participants, talking about their difficult stories is highly emotionally charged. And that is the reason why I'm using photography. They help, the pictures, they help to convey things that you can't convey by words anymore, the painful, deep things that are unimaginable to explain in words. And the design of the study is such that it is a very sensitive and mindful way of holding our participants through telling their stories. I'm hoping that this study will create a greater understanding of refugees who have experience of being refugee children, and that experience, that understanding of that experience will enable NHS workers, social care workers, charity workers, academics, policymakers to understand what the needs are and how to meet those needs and how to support the refugees. And I'm hoping also that the general public, if they were to hear these stories, to truly hear those stories, then maybe we will stop seeing refugees as a separate group of people. Maybe we would see ourselves as in it. We are all the same people. Some of us have these experiences, and if we understand these experiences from a position of us as a human being, perhaps some of those things that you were talking about, Amy, like targeted hostility and perceived difference, maybe that difference wouldn't be that great. Maybe. That is my hope. And I've noticed in the comments some really interesting comments about poor integration of refugees in the UK, at least in comparison to USA and Canada. And the barriers to higher education are some of the barriers are the early education. So I'm hoping that these stories that this study will collect and share, that these stories would help to inform those needs and hopefully address a little bit that integration aspect as well. So I am currently recruiting, and I would invite anyone who would like to talk to me as a participant or as anyone who would like to pass on my information to potential participants. Please get in touch, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Apologies for the delay there. I was having some issues with my mouse. That was a really heartfelt talk. Thank you so much, Anya. And I just wanted to repeat something that really resonated with me, and I'm sure did with a lot of our listeners here, with when we really listen and tell each other our stories, we break through the borders. And I just thought that was really touching and so true. And stories are very powerful. So wish you all the best with your research, and we look forward to hearing what you find as a result. So bear with me whilst I get the slides in order again. We have our final speaker for this morning. Sincere apologies for those of you who are maybe needing to leave. We are overrunning this event, unfortunately, so apologies. My internet cutting out didn't help. But we are going to have our final speaker, and we will still look at some of the questions that we've got in the chat. And I'm sure any questions in the chat that don't get answered as part of this live session, we will follow up via email. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kelly to give the final talk. So passing over now to you, Kelly, with the mouse control.
Thanks, Marie, and thanks to Marie and Pascal for organising this event. I can be quite brief, actually. That's going to be a tough one to follow, Anya. Thank you so much. That was really moving. So I'll try and pick up. Again, I'll be brief because I really would hate to not leave time for questions. I was going to talk about a project that I did with a colleague at the University of Manchester and with co-researchers from City of Sanctuary, Manchester, back in 2019. And it really picks up on some of the themes that Anya was talking about in terms of the kind of human connection and solidarity. So my research is primarily kind of theoretical, which is not everybody's cup of tea. And I'm interested in thinking about how we understand solidarity, partly with that sort of human commitment to extending and fostering solidarity, because of the sort of experiences that Amy's talked about, where unfortunately this is not always the way that something that characterises our interactions with others. So I'll just talk about it quite briefly. I might skip over some of the sort of detail of the project just to talk more about sort of my reflections on the project such as it is to date. So it's a fairly early stage, again, with not sort of complete findings. So I'm just going to skip to the next slide if I can. Yeah, okay, so the kind of context of this was us, again, as I've said, wanting to understand the basis of solidarity in society, solidarity with people that often don't experience solidarity. We chose to look at City of Sanctuary because for us it was very interesting the way that City of Sanctuary starts from a kind of local place of connection and seeks to extend a more cosmopolitan sense of solidarity with others. Sorry, I'm just going to have to move there we go, so I can see my slides. That's better. Okay, so this was the sort of starting point. We were interested in understanding more about the possibilities. Sorry, my laptop is going slow. So this is the thing I wanted to focus on most. We ran 2 events in Manchester. The first was a preparatory event in which we involved sanctuary seekers from City of Sanctuary Manchester to prepare them for a second event, which brought together sanctuary seekers and volunteers from COS Manchester with academics from around the country to try and explore everyday solidarity. So this is a tweet from Liz Hibbard from Manchester City of Sanctuary with some photos of that event. So down at the bottom here, you've got our bottom right, you've got the people from COS Manchester. Above that, you can see the event in a seminar room in Manchester where we had academics on a panel with some of our sanctuary seekers. A really great event, a really, really good day. So we had 4 discussion sessions on the day. We combined academic colleagues with COS volunteers and sanctuary seekers. As I mentioned, this was preceded a week before by a prep session run with COS. And our aim was to foster discussion on how everyday border practices influence senses of identity, solidarity, responsibility, and rightful place. We had 3 themes for the discussions. One was on the role that education can play in influencing the experiences of asylum seekers and refugees. So that obviously picks up on themes that have already been discussed today. We also discussed the contemporary challenges of cross-border solidarity between sanctuary seekers and local people within communities. Again, this picks up on some of the things that Amy was talking about. And we wanted to think a little bit about some of the kind of ethical implications of how we represent refugees and asylum seekers through organisations such as City of Sanctuary, but also as academics writing about refugees and asylum seekers. So those were the things that we wanted to try and explore on the day. My colleague at Manchester and I then used this as a follow-up to try to apply funding to do a much wider scale research project engaging with City of Sanctuary throughout England. Unfortunately, this wasn't successful in the end, so we didn't get the funding to do this. So it's something that we will try and pick up later on. But what we want to do going forward is to engage in a much more systematic way with the practices of UK City of Sanctuary movement, because they combine this rootedness in local towns and cities with sort of outward looking form of solidarity, deliberately seeking to counter racism, discrimination and hate. So we want to go ahead and undertake some in-depth research. As I said, we haven't got the money to do that at the moment. Very conscious of time, so I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit to some of the detail of the project. So one of the things that we wanted to do and still want to do, and we'll try and get money from elsewhere to do this, is to integrate some refugee co-researchers in the project. So we wanted to embed co-research principles to try and address some of those power inequalities that we're worried about when we're writing about and representing refugees and asylum seekers, to try to bring their voices really centrally into the project and to allow them to contribute as sort of active equals. So our plan is to recruit, appoint and mentor some 3 paid refugee research assistants, if anyone will ever give us the money to do so. I'm just going to skip ahead some of my sort of early reflections on the challenges we faced. One of the main challenges we faced, and again this picks up on a theme already mentioned, was that we wanted to compensate the asylum seekers, sanctuary seekers, for their time, for their contribution, for their fantastic reflections at our event in Manchester. And we just couldn't find a way to do this because of UK law around asylum, and because of universities' financial and tax policies. So we just couldn't find a way to do this, which was such an enormous frustration for us on the day. We also encountered some really interesting, some really interesting thoughts about the kind of duty of care and ethical challenges. So we did prep the sanctuary seekers, and we've made it very clear that they didn't have to share any more than they wanted to, but they wanted to share their stories with us, actually. And they shared some very, again, you know, traumatic things with us. And it was a really, really different atmosphere to a standard sort of academic panel, and one that we came away from feeling quite differently. We went also for a drink afterwards, and that was really interesting as well. So it was a really informative early kind of session, again, we hope to kind of go forward and try really to understand how we might foster more solidarity, just because of that human point that Anya made about how important it is to engage with others on a human level. So I don't want to say any more, I don't think. I really want to open it up to questions from others, so I'll be quiet and hand back to Marie. And Marie's having internet problems today, so here she is.
Yes, apologies everyone. I am having some internet issues today, so I'm a bit slow on the mark here. And I've been having some issues with accessing the chat as well for some reason. So again, thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you very much for being mindful of the time. Really appreciate you kind of doing a really brief version of your talk there to allow some questions, because we have got some fantastic questions. So I'm going to launch straight into some of these. And some of them I think are directed to some of our specific speakers here, but so I'm going to kind of point them to some speakers. But you know, please, our panel of speakers, please do feel free to sort of chip in at any point. So the first question, sort of going back to our first talk, we had a question about is it the case that refugees often have a lower educational background in comparison to home? And if so, what can be done to support that gap? So I think that was particularly referring to Agata's talk. So Agata, I don't know if you want to have a go at answering that question.
Sure, thank you. Well, we don't actually know. So the UK government doesn't really check it. They did in the past, but I think the latest kind of a large scale census of newly arrived asylum seekers has been a good few years ago, but that has shown that majority at that point who are coming to UK actually had secondary education, so adults had completed higher secondary education, and there is some research in Europe, in the Southern Europe, kind of in the arrival countries, that also suggests that who can make it to Europe, it's not cheap for refugees to get to Europe. This is already selective in a way. So people who can afford the journey often will come from in some way, in relative ways, privileged backgrounds back home. So a lot of the people that I've spoken to have prior experiences of education. It's both those who are already at university, so great, but also people who have previous degrees, PhDs, but still can't find job and would like to continue some higher education, for example, teacher training, but their qualifications are not recognized. They, even if they completed previous studies in the UK, but it was long ago, so they don't have the language paperwork, that's not approved by universities for entry. And in terms of what can we do about filling the gaps for those who come with gaps in education, well, there are things that we can do. So we, in the UK, for example, we accept unusual educational backgrounds for mature students. So anyone who is over 21 years old can be assessed in a different way by university, looking at their experiences and professional or voluntary work, for example, in judging their capacity to learn. But from the people that I've spoken to, only one was treated as a mature student and treated in the same way, and others were not. So there's no flexibility, even though they were also over 21, because of the their status, they were mostly looked at as forced migrant applicants, refugee applicants, and not mature students. And so there was no flexibility for them. But for those who really need some additional help before they have the capacity to learn at university, obviously we don't want to set people up to fail. There are some great programs around the country. Some universities are doing really great work. It's limited at the moment. So working with colleges might be a good way of supporting it more locally. But the programs that are there, for example, the Olive program at the University of East London, people travel there from Hull, from Wales every weekend to access the specialist support program, you know, using the little allowances that they have for travel, because education is so important for them. And that's the opportunity they can access. And they go every weekend, you know, spending their food money on train tickets to access education. So there are ways. They involved money very often, and cooperation between different bodies, organizations. I hope, yeah, I could speak longer, but I'm sure there are other questions still.
It sounds like you could give another 20-minute talk on that, Agata, but we'll move on to our next question. Thank you so much for giving such a full answer. And I love that you're being very practical with a lot of the things that you're talking about. So next question, I have this for myself, but I think maybe some similar kind of questions came up, and this is more for Amy's talk. So I work in public engagement, as I mentioned, so I'm always very interested in sustained engagement and sustained relationships with different kind of groups and participants and things like that. And something you mentioned was that your continued engagement with participants is what generated more impacts coming through. So, you know, I'm very interested in this kind of initial response being, oh, it's fine, it's daily, I just get on with it, in terms of experiencing these daily microaggressions. And then it was after a sustained engagement with those people that actually you started getting through, actually, no, this makes me scared every day, and getting some of these negative impacts actually coming through. And I just wondered, what from your experience, what is it that's kind of contributing to that change and sort of opening up of these sort of deeper, more harmful impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question, Marie, because I didn't get a chance to talk about my kind of methodology at all. Yeah, it was extensive and quite labour intensive at times. I worked with lots of groups across the city that were kind of based all over the city. I went to places of worship. I worked with charities and organisations, community-based groups, and it was very evident from the start that one of the things that I needed to do was become a familiar face. And I attended these drop-in sessions week in, week out. Some of it was English language lessons, so I got involved with them. I volunteered with them. I attended employability workshops, bake sales, Zumba classes, like you name it, I did it. I went, and really, like, it might sound a bit cheesy, but that was the sustained engagement, and that was what was necessary to just show that I was genuine in my efforts to get to know people. There was one particular moment that I will never forget, and it was with one particular group of Somali women that I worked really closely with. And at one point, another researcher came in from a different university to do something, I think it was around FGM, and they came in and they were only there for a few hours and they kind of disappeared, and I'm sure they ever came back. But we were kind of in the room together, and then at one point you could see this person kind of looking at me thinking, like, what's she doing here? And the women there just said, oh, she's one of us, like, she's just here to help out. And it was just like a sort of defining moment, almost, of like, I would never consider myself an insider to these situations. I'm very aware, and I talk at length about my positionality with the research as a white British middle class researcher. But it made the point that I wasn't purely an outsider anymore, that there was this kind of informed insider-outsider dynamic going on. And another way in which I managed to do that was not just through kind of your bog standard interviews. So I engaged with more kind of creative methods. So I used mapping activities, walking methods, just to try and engage people in a more meaningful way, I guess, because it was much more interesting for them, and they took ownership of that work, and it helped with the kind of power dynamics that were at play within the research as well. And in placing them as the educator and me as somebody that was kind of coming in to learn from them, that was something that they really took on board and was super helpful to me in doing.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. And I think that that's echoed in a lot of the work that I do, actually. So it's really, for me, I think the key word that I was sort of hoping you would say, and you actually avoided saying, and I wonder if you did that on purpose, is trust. So you basically went out there and, you know, acted like a normal person who was interested in getting to know a group of people, and, you know, all the things that come around that kind of showed that genuine interest in sort of developing the trust of those people. And obviously, you know, the impact that had was that you were able to get some real genuine insights into the more difficult experiences that those people were having. So yeah, thank you so much for answering that question of mine. Another couple of quick questions. So unfortunately, we have lost Anya. She's had to go on to other work that she's got to do today. So again, I do apologise for the overrunning of this event, but for those of you who can stay for just a few minutes longer, we have a question here, I think for Agata maybe, but anyone else who can answer, we're happy to jump in. How significant does having a named contact in admissions at universities really have for people trying to access higher education, as I think this is recommended by City of Sanctuary? So Agata, I don't know if you want to have a go at answering that, or anyone else from our panel.
Super important. So it's something that came out in my findings as well, in terms of people saying we're lacking a personal contact. It's something that's recognized by the people who work in universities, and kind of a power around the decision making about the admissions. There are rules on admissions, but they can be, you know, if the personal connections that applicants can develop can make a huge difference. So if there is a personal, if there is a named person, and the applicants can send them the samples of writing, for example, arrange the interview, that can be accepted as a language requirement by a lot of institutions, for example. No cost, other than the time of the named person. Not having to retell your story several times, which can be re-traumatizing itself, super helpful. Having someone who then, when you go to university, because this obviously doesn't end there, it's not just about access, students need support throughout. So either it being the same person or that person introducing the newly arrived students during the period of transition to others, it's very useful as well. I think it's one of the crucial things, low cost, is that it doesn't have to be a new person, obviously, just someone in each institution with relevant training, knowing what the legislation is, what the rules are, what's available in the institution, and what can be done for the participants. Yeah, super important.
Great, thank you very much, Agata. And we also have Pascal from our own Leicester team, who I'm going to just invite to have a comment on that as well.
Yes, I can also comment on this because I am that one point of contact at the University of Leicester. We have a sanctuary seekers unit, so a physical unit at Leicester. And in my role, I'm kind of a connector, and I will link to people in different teams across the university so that the students don't have to labor to find that person, or on occasion, if I see maybe someone has applied and the application was rejected, I will look at it and then talk to people I know in admissions, be like, okay, but can you talk to the admissions tutor in the department? Can we find a different ways to assess them? And it has been successful on a number of occasions. But yeah, I would say it really works. And I recommend all institutions put this in place for sure.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Pascal. So I'm going to give one more question. As I said, those of you who submitted comments and questions that we've not necessarily addressed in this session, don't worry, we'll do our best to kind of get back to you. But I've got one final question, and it's going to be around Kelly's talk. And again, just because it really resonates with some difficulties and challenges that I have in my own area of work within a university. And that is, what could universities do, in your view, to create easier ways of co-producing research? This is an incredibly difficult challenge if you want to really truly co-create research and create new data and have all of these ethics and data management plans and all of the policies within these institutions all checked. It's actually incredibly difficult to properly co-produce work. So I'm going to put that to Kelly first, and then again, if our panel members want to jump in, you're welcome.
Thanks, Marie. God, that's the $1,000 question, isn't it? It's so important. And I think, particularly at Leicester, where, Leicester does have a kind of, I think, a proud history of sort of trying to be outward looking, but at the same time, very rooted in kind of local community. And, we are citizens of change at Leicester, apparently. So it's a really good question. I don't think the answers to it, but I think it was a severe frustration to us to not be able to find a way that we could compensate our sanctuary seekers for the really valuable discussions that we have with them. Clearly with refugees, it's different because of the kind of legal position, but we found that really, really difficult, knowing how the situation they were in. So obviously we were able to get funds from Leicester. Actually, we had a small pot of money to reimburse travel, to provide food and those kinds of things, but it wasn't enough. I think a starting point would just be having kind of serious discussions about that. Actually, perhaps that's something that we can take forward, to have those discussions about what we can do to really co-create research that does empower refugees and sanctuary seekers. And I'd like to open up to others again. So I couldn't answer it, but yeah, it's a really good question and one that we ought to keep discussing, I think.
I did give you quite a tricky question, Kelly. So, and I think, there aren't any finite answers to that question at the moment, but I think what's encouraging is that there's lots of different people in different kind of spaces within universities who are trying to figure this out. So very happy to link up with you actually after this and see if we can pull our resources together to make some changes in our own university. But just before we wrap up, would any of our other panel members like to comment or any final comments? Okay, well, in that case, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning. Thank you very much to everyone who organised and contributed to the session today, our wonderful speakers, Pascal and the wider team. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and apologies for running late, but I hope those of you who were able to stay thought it was worth it. So enjoy the rest of Refugee Week, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks again.
And thank you, Mary, for hosting so brilliantly.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.